What about this man here? If this is indeed Christopher Marlowe?
Well, he does at least have the track record of being an excellent writer in the same genre as William Shakespeare, and is acknowledged as a very powerful influence on Shakespeare's writing. He essentially didn't exactly completely invent blank verse drama, but he was the first person to make it work, and the English history play. He wrote long narratives out of Ovid, so he has Hero and Leander. The first publication with William Shakespeare's name on it is Venus and Adonis, which is almost that sort of pair of poems, very similar poems.
He's a great writer.
He has the right writing.
Of course, we would say
background,
but he ain't Shakespeare.
Well, he certainly wasn't Shakespeare at the time. He's supposed to have died at the age of 29, but then nor was Shakespeare. And I think you said in your book, Stanley, Shakespeare and Co., you said that if Shakespeare had died in the same year that Marlowe's meant to have died, 1593, we would regard Marlowe as the better writer.
No, what I said was if Shakespeare had died in the same year as Marlowe did die, 1593.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah,
yes, you're quite right.
We would regard Marlowe as the better writer.
Yes, I believe that. There would have been more great writing from Marlowe than there had been at that point from William Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Though, of course, at that time, Shakespeare had already written some plays, so if you think Marlowe wrote them as well,
well, there were plays that were already written which we now attribute to Shakespeare, but nothing appeared with the name William Shakespeare on it until a couple of weeks after Marlowe died, or supposedly died.
Oh, well, there are the plays in the first folio. They're attributed to Shakespeare.
Yes, but they're not attributed to him until 1623. And in fact, until the 1920s, quite a lot of Orthodox scholars, including some very well-respected names, attributed things like the Henry VI plays to Marlowe. So, in fact, there was a whole school of thought that some of those early plays were essentially Marlowe plays that Shakespeare had taken on and rewritten and adapted. And,
I mean, Ros, your novel takes the premise that Marlowe didn't die in 1593, and I'm not sure whether that's something you actually believe or not. You question the evidence.
I question the evidence around his death, yeah.
But the evidence doesn't have to be true in order for your novel to tell a good story.
No, it is a work of fiction, as I keep trying to reassure people, and you can thoroughly enjoy it no matter who you believe is the author of Shakespeare, especially if you love Shakespeare, because I've brought a lot of sort of Shakespeare references in.
You see, for Stanley and I, it does matter, absolutely, that the evidence that exists for Marlowe's death, the coroner's report and a burial record, are good enough pieces of historical evidence, wherever one's coming from, which make them undeniable.
Well, I mean, this was the interesting point for me when I read Charles Nichols' chapter in your book on Marlowe, is that Charles Nichols himself has written a very excellent book, I have to say, The Reckoning, and then another version of it 10 years later, in which he very much disputes that the inquest document is true. Now, he doesn't dispute the burial record, but he does dispute the inquest document. He raises all kinds of issues with it, as people have ever since it was first discovered in 1925. And the fact is that there's been no real agreement as to the veracity of the inquest document. Scholars have been very much split, and I would say the majority believe the inquest document to be false.
Well, the important thing is that he's dead, and you're not disputing that evidence. If he's dead, he can't go on to write the works of Shakespeare. Of course, this is all partly to do with the fictional. You've written this excellent, fascinating novel in verse with a great many different poems in it. It's not a single verse narrative, and it's only one of many, many novels that have been written. The most famous one, perhaps, is the one by Anthony Burgess, Nothing Like the Sun. And we have a chapter in our book by Paul Franson about fictional treatments of this topic. There have been many novels over a good, as you said yourself, the first suggestion of Marlowe came in a novel about a little less than 100 years
It's
ago.
interesting, and Paul Franson in his chapter identifies fictional tropes among that body of work, that genre, and one of them is that Shakespeare has to be presented normally is presented in that genre as an uneducated person from a town which is in a sort of backwater, and that constant trope, we had it in the film Anonymous.
Oh, very much so, where he's a drunken, illiterate buffoon.
And actually, one of the things about the Marlowe papers is Shakespeare hardly appears.
Yes.
And I just wondered why that was the case.
Yes, I did completely sideline him, I agree. I have him agreeing to be the front and sort of represent the plays, but Well, actually, one of the things I base that on is the fact that there is so little personal testimony around him, that he doesn't seem to have hung out with other writers. We don't have anything, you know, he doesn't seem to belong to that circle of writers in London. And, you know, no one ever reports a conversation with him in a pub, or, you know, there's no obvious communication with him. He doesn't get involved in that commendatory poems business. And so he seems to me a very taciturn man. He keeps himself to himself. And also, because I know Diana Price has shown that there are periods of time when we expect him to be in London, and it turns out that he's in Stratford. He's doing some business in Stratford. So I imagined him being really quite absent for the purpose of the book. I thought that would work rather well. But I think, you know, I agree that there is this trope in fiction of really diminishing as much as possible William Shakespeare of Stratford, and sometimes making him quite an objectionable character. And I think that is, you know, entirely for the purpose, I suppose, of making a good story or something, you know, making a baddie. I didn't want to make him a baddie. I think if he was, you know, in the role, which he is in the novel, where he's protecting this man's life by agreeing to front his plays, then, you know, he's doing him good service, you know, he's doing a good job. So I didn't want to take him apart.
My favourite depiction of Shakespeare in any novel is in Virginia Woolf's Orlando, in which Orlando sees Shakespeare writing. And it's a rare account in any work of how Shakespeare physically sat or looked when he was writing. And the whole narrative just stops. And you know it's supposed to be Shakespeare, and he keeps cropping up in Orlando. And Orlando stares at Shakespeare from across the room. Is this a writer? Tell me everything that ever happened in the world. It's a marvellous moment. Let's think about part two, Shakespeare as author, theorising Shakespeare's authorship by Andrew Hadfield, University of Sussex. That chapter really is incredibly helpful, I think, because it's about helping us all to relax about the fact that we shouldn't be worried about there being gaps in the records of people's lives, or that the kinds of records that we would most wish to see in someone's life don't in fact survive and aren't there.
I did have a problem with that chapter. I mean, Andrew is, you know, someone I know rather well as my PhD supervisor, but you know, he'd already been challenged on this point, I believe, when he put this in 60 minutes, and challenged with the data of Diana Price, because it is actually unusual. The number of gaps, the amount of gap that there is, if you like, this man-shaped absence of data is actually extraordinary. And, you know, I thought it was problematic for me in that chapter that I would like to see an answer to Price. I haven't yet seen an answer to Price's data showing that Shakespeare's, the gap in Shakespeare evidence that actually shows he was a writer, because we have a huge amount of evidence about him, more than any other writer, but not related to writing.
It's how you approach evidence, isn't it? It's how what you decide to do with that evidence. And Diana Price has a different agenda, I think, there with her telling of history. Andrew Hadfield is right in saying that we shouldn't be worried about.
Well, is he? Because they are extraordinary gaps. They're not the usual gaps. They are exceptional gaps, and that hasn't yet been answered. And I'd like to see an answer to that.
But
sorry, Karen Stanley.
Well, I'm going to say in my chapter, the next chapter of the book, I produce a great many allusions to Shakespeare as a writer.
But they don't link to the Shakespeare of Stratford, and there's no link to him until long after he's dead. But that's 1623.
That's 1623, you know. But that's only 7 years after he's dead. And why not? Why discount evidence from after somebody's dead?
Can I just jump in here and say, the first reference to that by corroborative evidence in the first folio, 1623, that funerary bust might have gone up in 1616. We do not know that it did.
No, we don't know when it went up. It's true. We don't know when it went up. But the point is, I want to know. I don't know if we can ever know, but I do want to know why there aren't references to him that show him that he actually knew other writers and that he had any kind of writerly life.
Well, there are writers who talk about a writer called
William Shakespeare. And that's not disputed. And Stanley very, I mean, I like, you know, you really take us through it year by year, and I really appreciate that, you know, piece by piece by piece, through the evidence of writers who know that there is a writer who publishes under that name, William Shakespeare, but none of them know him personally. There's certainly no indication that they know him personally. If they did know him personally, they don't reveal a personal
it's not quite true. I mean, there's the Manningham anecdote about Shakespeare.
But that's an anecdote, and he's heard it from Mr. Curl. So he clearly doesn't know Shakespeare personally, and also we don't know. It doesn't say that he's a writer.
We can't. I think
he's connected to theatre.
But I think what I'm hearing from you, Roz, which is an absolutely, completely understandable longing, we sometimes don't have the evidence for the kinds of things that we would like to have evidence for. And the fact that we don't have evidence isn't evidence of absence.
But if you ask someone who's in evidence science, like Professor David Shum, who is Emeritus Professor of Evidence Science at UCL, he says that where there is absence of evidence where you would expect evidence to be, that in itself is an important piece of evidence that needs to be accounted for by any explanatory narrative.
We can't always account for evidence.